Welcome back to our series discussing Call to Community, the life Jesus wants for his people. We are on chapter 4 of this amazing collection of writings on community. It's a good one. It's by the Catholic theologian Gerhard Lohfink, who is a good friend of the community, a good friend of the Bruderhof. Mm-hmm. I think he's a member of the Integrated Gemeinde, the integrated community in Germany and Rome, and he's written some amazing books. Among my favorite is Jesus and Community. If you haven't read that, it came out in 1984, I believe, 2 years after I was born. Great book. Take a look at that one. But this selection is from another book, Does God Need the Church? And the title of the chapter is
Embodiment.
Embodiment.
It's kind
It
of
like threw me off a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But it's worth reading.
It's a fantastic chapter. And Lohfink starts out by talking about the fundamental problem with the church being that it's set off to the side and faith no longer saturates every aspect of society. And he basically says it's just window dressing. It's something people do, and they could easily just as well not do it as do it. You could just as easily go to church or decide not to go to church, and it wouldn't really affect how you led your life, mm-hmm. What entertainment you consumed, what social circles you moved in.
Yeah, it's basically something like faith being something you could just set aside and then resume when you go to church, rather than it permeating every aspect of your life.
Now, I'm not sure when this was written.
Didn't you say it was 1984?
No, that's Jesus and Community was written in 1984. This was written in 1999, so 22 years ago, and probably was a great criticism back then. I would say, like, as we've seen churches in the past decade sort of hemorrhaging members, you could say it was almost prophetic in the fact that many people were able to just jettison their faith communities, their churches, and leave them and continue to lead their lives. Mm-hmm. But that's not the purpose of that's not what he doesn't just stick with mourning this. He talks about how faith needs to be integrated into all aspects of life.
Yeah, and I have to say, reading this chapter for me, even though like I've committed to living out my faith, it was a challenge. Mm-hmm. And that's I just want to let you guys know, watching this video, like it's also a challenge for me to be more intentional about everything I do every day, not in a somber way, but
sure.
With joy. And
what did you think about this? What did you think about this one thing? Faith is drying up. It no longer has any material that it can transform. It has become unworldly and therefore ineffectual. In what way should faith permeate our life more? Does this mean we're supposed to be going around and having religious conversations all day long? Does it mean, our entertainment should be, I don't know, Bible trivia? What does it mean to have faith permeate every aspect of your life, all day?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think it's more just in, at least for me, probably how I conduct myself, like just making sure I'm not gossiping about someone else, or that every person that I encounter, I see the love of God in them and try to connect with that. And I don't think that's necessarily with a lot of religious language. Actually, one of the people that commented on our last video, I thought they had a really challenging insight. They said, like, there's a difference between knowing and believing, and how a lot of people believe without knowing, and a lot of people know without believing. And I think bringing those two together is really where faith can probably flourish the most. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I was similarly. I think what's really a really important thing to remember is that, you know, when we at least in the Christian tradition, when we experience a conversion, we experience a radical reorientation of our life. And I know, like, in the time of my, you know, baptismal formation, what was talked about was everything that was up has to come down, and everything that was down has to come up. In other words, your whole life has to reorient. And I think that's just a really important insight when, you know, especially for new believers, but then as we continue along in our walk, that we don't just continue life as it was. And, you know, sometimes that demands different things, you know, at different stages that might demand different things of you. And it's not to say there's only one way to do this, but there has to be a change, a visible change in the way life is conducted.
And also for me, it's just every time I go back to the Sermon on the Mount, like having that deeper understanding of what Jesus means when he talks about the first shall be last, and blessed are the meek or the vulnerable, the people that you don't really think of being strong or powerful or lifted up. So like Rich was saying, it really is kind of an upside down understanding of life, and a rejection of like the worldliness, in as much as it promotes power that is not of Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on here a bit, because there's some other really great sections here. So he talks about here, it's again what we were talking about last week, sort of the individual and community. Great line here. An individual cannot first begin to believe alone and then afterward join the church community. Accepting faith already means desiring the communion of believers. And made me think, reading this line, when we experience baptism here in the Bruderhof, we recite the Nicene Creed, which has the line, I believe, in the fellowship of saints, the communion of saints. And I was, you know, as a younger person, I always imagined sort of this communion of saints up in the sky, you know, more
like a Byzantine painting.
Yeah. But I think what Lohfink points here too is the fellowship of saints exists right now. That's what we believe in, you know, and that's part of our creed. So you can't really say that confession or that creed without having a connection with a fellowship. And I have talked with people who've gotten baptized more in the sense of personal rebirth, and wonderful, but I think that's something that they were missing was that connection that had already been established to a fellowship.
Yeah. And another thing that this chapter points out is that Christian faith, like Jewish faith, subjects all of life to the promise and claim of God. Its nature is such that it interpenetrates all aspects of the lives of the believers and gives them a new form. And that made me think, I have some Jewish friends that are really conservative, and seeing how their faith permeates every aspect of their life, and like how they prepare for meals and fellowship and certain prayers they do at certain times. And on the one hand, I'm thankful that I'm not constricted to that, but on the other hand, this chapter did make me think how they have like a structure where they have to interact with their faith, and how we as believers might not have such a specific set of rules, but we have to be a little more intentional about it.
Yeah. Well, and that can be a personal thing, a personal rhythm, and like, I mean, I think a liturgy like I guess that basically is a liturgy is important, but it's also important to recognize that we do evolve and change, and our needs, what works in one season doesn't work in another season, and that's where liturgy can become a dead letter.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of brings us back to the title of the chapter of Embodiment, where Lohfink talks about how that looks potentially in a communion of believers.
There's a really cool section here where he talks about how often in the letters of Paul they talk about houses.
Yes.
How houses are often referred to. It is amazing how many houses are known to us by name simply in connection with the apostolic work and journeys of Paul. The house of Lydia, the seller of purple cloth in Philippi, the house of Jason in Thessalonica, those of Titius Justus and Gaius in Corinth.
Such cool names.
Right, yeah. The house of the evangelist Philip in Caesarea. And he has a kind of an interesting insight here that in antiquity,
Yeah.
and for a long time thereafter, the house was a larger social unit. So a lot of us, in the modern world today, we think of houses as a place we go home. That's our own little space, where we have our, place for relaxation, and we have our little meal, and this is our kingdom. Back then, a house was like more of a multi-generational. There was also a place of work.
Yeah, that's what I picked up on. It's like where they actually conducted their business affairs as well as living. So that was
Right.
like integrated like a community.
Yeah.
Like we try to do that as well.
Yeah. So there wasn't this sort of artificial separation between different areas of life. It was all within these houses that this new faith was being nurtured and cultured. And what does that have to say to us today, where so much of our lives are fractured between different areas? So very neat stuff. And then this last section, just want to cover this real quick, because I thought this is such an important insight for anybody who is trying to live together in community, because inevitably we run up against problems in community. And Lohfink says here, we know enough about these early Christian communities talked about in the book of Acts, that we are in no danger of glorifying the community life of those times. And then he talks about the letters to the Corinthians, where he was addressing big problems in the community, immoral living,
But also
squabbles.
And also just like a certain amount of arrogance.
And arrogance.
So it's nice to know they struggled with those things then as well.
From the jump, they were dealing with these.
Yeah, and social conflicts. That was part of it.
Yeah, between rich and poor, and people being more important than each other. But crucially, Lohfink says, what distinguishes those communities is not their moral integrity or the power of their faith, still less their unanimity. Nevertheless, Paul calls them the saints. He thus expresses the conviction that what is crucial is not the mistakes that are made. There will always be those. Theological foolishness is also not decisive. That's lucky. There will never be a lack of that. Not even sin and guilt are the most important things. However dreadful they often are, they can be forgiven. What is decisive, after all, what everything depends on, is that the community knows that God has called it to make the divine plan visible. I think that's just a really beautiful and reassuring word there. Because often, we do come face to face with our own human frailty and folly, and you wonder, are we really pleasing God in our life together? But the fact that Paul could say to the church in Corinth, you are the called, you are God's beloved, means that.
And do you think that Lohfink, when he talks about making the divine plan visible, that could be equated to the kingdom here on earth?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what he's talking about.
Like Blumhardt from the last chapter.
That's exactly it. So we don't have to be great at it. I mean, we should strive to be great at it, and make renewed efforts every day to be better at it. But it's simply the intention and the will, I think, is what he's saying here, to make the divine plan visible.
Yeah. And what better thing to do as a believer than make that your task and your challenge?
Yeah, gives meaning to everything you do. Well, thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Yeah, thanks for all your comments. We do read them and we get a lot out of them, so appreciate it.
See you next week.